Annie Pinero had designed 62 luxury events in 4 years, and not one of them had been interrupted by her ex-boyfriend proposing until the night she was working for a man the Miami-Dade prosecutors called impossible to touch. The first sign something was wrong came at 8:34 p.m., 46 minutes into cocktail hour, when Carlos, head of Ralph's security detail, touched his earpiece and went still with the kind of alertness usually reserved for federal raids. The second sign was the gray Tom Ford suit she recognized moving through the orchid installation, walking past security like he'd been invited. Russell. Her phone almost dropped from her hand. 23 vendor confirmations waited in her inbox, demanding attention. The caterers were in the kitchen executing a menu she'd spent 6 weeks perfecting. 200 guests moved through the grounds she'd transformed into something that belonged in Architectural Digest. The jazz trio had been playing Coltrane variations for an hour. And now Russell Lampkins, the ex-boyfriend she'd left in Atlanta to get away from, was at Ralph Swanson's fundraiser, saying her name like the 7 years since she'd walked out meant nothing. Annie, wait. We need to talk. Just give me 2 minutes. She couldn't move. Couldn't process. Because Russell being here wasn't just unprofessional, it was a threat. Ralph Swanson didn't accept complications. She'd watched him end a business relationship over a contractor who showed up 30 minutes late to a morning meeting. What would he do to the ex-boyfriend currently disrupting his event? Through the terrace doors, she saw heads turning, conversations stopping. The attention shifted like a spotlight finding its target. Judge Morales set down his drink, expression hardening. This was professional annihilation. This was every fear she'd carried since leaving Atlanta turned into reality. Then Ralph moved. The host cut through his own guests with unnerving calm, and Annie's chest tightened because she knew that expression. She'd seen it when a city councilman tried to leverage him. She'd seen it during a site inspection when a building owner attempted to renegotiate their deal. She'd seen it in his Coconut Grove office during late-night planning sessions when his focus on her felt like something that could burn through steel. Ralph Swanson didn't just move through spaces, he owned them. And right now, he was moving toward the man holding a ring box like it gave him authority. But he didn't look at Russell. He looked at her. Their eyes locked across 40 feet of imported stone pavers, across 4 months of meetings that ran too long and conversations that felt too personal, across every moment she'd convinced herself she was misreading the way he watched her like a man studying something he intended to keep. And Ralph's expression changed. Not anger. Something more deliberate. The look of a man who'd just been given the justification he'd been waiting for. "You're in the wrong place," Ralph said to Russell, voice carrying without effort. His hand moved to straighten his cuff in a motion that made 3 security guards shift position immediately. "I'm exactly where I need to be. Annie and I need to finish a conversation. This doesn't concern you. Everything here concerns me." Ralph didn't touch Russell. Didn't threaten him directly. He simply turned and walked toward Annie with the absolute certainty of a man who'd already decided how this ended. The caterer's staging area suddenly felt impossibly small. Ralph filled the entrance, blocking out the party lights, the music, everything except the weight of his attention settling on her like something physical. "Do you want him here?" His voice dropped low enough only she could hear. "No." The word barely made it past her throat. "I don't know how he knew about tonight. I'll handle this, I'll make sure." Ralph's hand closed around hers. His grip was warm, unbreakable, and before Annie could understand what was happening, he pulled her out of the staging area, through the terrace doors, into full view of 200 guests. "What are you doing?" Fear sharpened her voice. He didn't answer. He raised their joined hands high enough for everyone to witness, turned to face the crowd and the judge now watching with narrow eyes and Russell frozen between security guards, and delivered 5 words that destroyed every boundary she'd built. "She already has me." What happens when a mafia boss publicly claims a woman in front of Miami's elite? When manipulation meets ambition and power becomes intimacy? If you want to see how far Annie and Ralph take this dangerous game, hit that subscribe button now because this story is about to get a lot more complicated. The silence lasted 3 seconds before Russell found his voice again. Annie, I know this looks crazy, but I've changed. I've had 2 years of therapy. I understand now what I did wrong, how I made you feel like your success was a problem instead of celebrating it. I'm ready now. Really ready. He opened the ring box with a flourish that made Annie's stomach turn. The diamond caught the party lights, probably 3 carats, probably from the jeweler on Miracle Mile where she used to window shop during lunch breaks in another lifetime. I want to build a life with you. The right way this time. No more making you feel like you need to be less so I can be more. I see you now, Annie. I finally see you. The crowd had gone completely still. Judge Morales looked between Russell and Ralph with the expression of someone watching a situation spiral toward violence. 2 women near the bar had their phones out, already recording. Annie's throat closed. This was the proposal she'd imagined 7 years ago, the words she'd needed to hear when she was 26 and convinced that wanting partnership instead of tolerance made her demanding. Now they just sounded like lines from a script Russell had memorized because someone told him what women wanted to hear. Ralph's hand tightened around hers, a warning or a promise, she couldn't tell which. Russell took a step forward, holding the ring box out like it was a treaty offering. Annie, please. Just think about it. Remember what we had. Remember. Ralph moved then, pulling Annie with him in a motion so smooth she barely registered it until they were standing directly in front of Russell. Ralph released her hand only to reach out and slam the ring box shut with enough force that the snap echoed across the terrace. The box hit the stone table beside them with a crack that might have been the wood or might have been something inside the velvet breaking. You're confused, Ralph said, his voice carrying the kind of calm that preceded hurricanes. So let me clarify the situation for you. He turned to face the crowd, keeping himself positioned between Annie and Russell like a barrier made of expensive fabric and controlled danger. Annie Pinero isn't available for your redemption arc. She isn't your second chance or your proof that therapy worked or whatever story you've told yourself to justify showing up here. She already has me. Ralph looked back at Annie then, and something in his expression made her breath catch. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a claim for show. It was a statement of fact he'd apparently decided was true the moment Russell opened his mouth. So take your ring and whatever rehearsed apology you brought with you, and leave my property before I stop being civilized about this interruption. Russell stared at Ralph, then at Annie, waiting for her to contradict the claim. Waiting for her to tell everyone this was a misunderstanding, that Ralph was just being protective, that she wasn't anyone's anything. Annie said nothing. And her silence, apparently, was answer enough. Annie's Audi pulled through the gate of Ralph's Coconut Grove compound at 7:43 in the morning, early enough that the security guard looked surprised to see her. She'd barely slept after Carlos drove her home from the fundraiser, her mind replaying the moment Ralph claimed her in front of Miami's elite, the moment her silence turned his declaration into something she couldn't take back. She'd rehearsed her speech the entire drive from Brickell, perfecting the tone that was professional but firm, the words that would establish boundaries without burning the bridge with her highest-paying client. Ralph opened the front door before she could knock, wearing linen pants and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, looking more relaxed than she'd ever seen him. Like last night hadn't just detonated her carefully constructed professional reputation. Behind him, she could see the dining room table set for 2, could smell coffee and something involving butter and citrus. You're earlier than I expected, he said, stepping aside to let her in. I have breakfast ready. I'm not here for breakfast. I'm here because what you did last night was completely out of line and we need to address it immediately. We will. After you eat. Ralph, I'm serious. You told 200 people that I'm yours. You made a claim in front of judges and city officials and clients I need to maintain professional relationships with. So am I. When was the last time you ate something that wasn't coffee and whatever you keep in your office desk drawer? Annie opened her mouth to argue, then realized she couldn't remember. The fundraiser had consumed her entire day yesterday, and she'd been too nauseous after Russell's appearance to consider food. After Carlos dropped her off, she'd spent 4 hours staring at her ceiling, trying to figure out how to undo what Ralph had done. Ralph gestured toward the dining room with the patience of someone who knew he'd already won. She followed, hating that she was following, hating more that the stone crab Benedict on the table looked perfect. He poured her coffee without asking how she took it, added exactly the right amount of cream, and slid the cup across the table like he'd been watching her prepare coffee for months. "The claim stays," he said, sitting down across from her. "Russell needed to understand that touching you means going through me first. That's not negotiable. I don't need protection. I left Russell 7 years ago. I built my entire business without anyone's help. I don't need you or anyone else deciding what's best for me. Have you checked your phone this morning? What does that have to do with anything? Check it." Annie pulled out her phone, irritation sharpening as she unlocked the screen. The notification count made her stomach drop. 43 missed calls. All from the same Atlanta number she deleted from her contacts years ago but still recognized like a scar she couldn't stop touching. "He called you 43 times between midnight and 6 a.m., Ralph said, his voice losing its casual edge. "He sent 16 text messages. Do you want to know what they say?" Annie's hand trembled slightly as she scrolled through the preview text. The messages started apologetic, then confused, then angry. The last one, sent at 5:47 this morning, just said, "You're making a mistake. He doesn't know you like I do." "This isn't protection," Ralph continued, leaning forward. "This is a statement of fact. You already have someone who will make sure Russell understands that no means no. The only question is whether you're going to let me do it my way or if you're going to keep pretending that being independent means handling obsession alone." Annie set down her phone, the notifications still glowing like small fires she couldn't put out. "Your way involves lying to 200 people about our relationship status." Ralph picked up his coffee, his expression unchanged. "Who said I was lying?" Annie saw Russell through the glass door of her design district office at 2:17 on Tuesday afternoon, and her first instinct was to lock the door and call security. Her second instinct, the one shaped by 5 years of making herself smaller, was to let him in and listen because maybe this time would be different. She hated that the second instinct still existed. He held 2 coffee cups from the place on Northeast 39th Street where she used to meet clients, back when she was building her business one consultation at a time. He'd remembered her order. Of course he'd remembered her order. "Annie, please. Just 5 minutes. I brought your favorite." She opened the door because her assistant Melissa was watching from the corner desk with her phone already in hand, and because turning him away on a public street felt more dangerous than controlling the conversation inside. Russell stepped in like he'd been invited, setting both coffees on her desk with the careful placement of someone handling a peace offering. "You look amazing. Really. Miami clearly agrees with you. What are you doing here, Russell? I needed to see you." To apologize properly, not in front of a crowd at some party. "What I said the other night came out wrong. I practiced it for weeks but then I saw you and everything just. You've been planning this for weeks?" His expression shifted, caught. "I mean, I've been thinking about us for months. Years, really. Therapy helped me understand what I lost when I let you go. You didn't let me go. I left. There's a difference. Annie, come on. We both made mistakes. I know I wasn't supportive enough of your career, but you have to admit you made it hard sometimes. All those late nights, all those clients who seemed more important than." She felt it then, the old pattern trying to reassert itself. The subtle reframing where her ambition became the problem and his resentment became reasonable. "You need to leave." The glass door opened before Russell could respond. Ralph walked in with Carlos behind him, both men filling her small office with a presence that made Russell take an instinctive step back. Ralph didn't acknowledge Russell. He pulled out his phone, tapped the screen twice, and turned it toward Annie. Security footage showed Russell's rental car parked across from her office. The timestamp read Saturday morning, 2 days after the fundraiser. "He's been here for 3 days, Ralph said. Watching. Waiting for you to be alone." Annie's skin went cold. Saturday she'd worked until 8. Sunday she'd come in for 4 hours. Monday she'd been here until midnight finishing a proposal. Russell's face flushed. I wasn't stalking her. I was trying to find the right time to talk without that scene you caused at your party. Ralph's expression didn't change. He looked at Annie, ignoring Russell completely. Say the word and I make this problem permanent. The offer hung in the air, specific enough that Annie understood exactly what permanent meant. Carlos shifted slightly, and she realized they'd come prepared for her answer to be yes. No, Annie said, forcing her voice steady. No, I handle this legally. Ralph studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. Legally takes time. He doesn't get to use that time to keep showing up where you work. He's leaving now, Annie said, looking at Russell finally. And he's not coming back. Ralph's penthouse occupied the entire 42nd floor of a Brickell Avenue tower that hadn't existed 5 years ago. Annie knew because she'd researched every property in his portfolio after he became a client, back when she thought understanding his business holdings would help her anticipate his needs. She hadn't anticipated this. The kitchen was restaurant grade, all stainless steel and Italian marble, the kind of space where serious cooking happened. Ralph moved through it with the efficiency of someone who'd worked in kitchens before he owned them, pulling ingredients from a refrigerator that probably cost more than her first car. You cook, Annie said, still standing near the entrance because sitting down felt like accepting something she hadn't agreed to yet. My mother insisted all her children learn. She said depending on other people to feed you was depending on them to keep you alive. He glanced back at her, something almost like amusement in his expression. Sit down, Annie. I'm not going to bite you. You told 200 people I belong to you. I told them you already have me. There's a difference. She sat, mostly because her legs were tired from standing in heels all day dealing with the aftermath of Russell's office appearance. 3 clients had called asking about her relationship status. 2 had asked if there were safety concerns they should know about. 1 had just congratulated her, which somehow felt worse than the others. Ralph cracked stone crab claws with practiced precision, the sound sharp in the quiet penthouse. I was 15 when I started running numbers for a guy named Hector in Little Havana. He paid me $200 a week to memorize bets and keep my mouth shut when cops came around. Why are you telling me this? Because you think I claimed you last night to play some game. You need to understand I don't play games with things that matter. He plated the crab with drawn butter and lemon, added roasted vegetables that looked like they belonged in a food magazine, and brought both plates to the table. The presentation was perfect. Everything Ralph did was perfect, which was exactly what made him dangerous. By 17 I was managing 3 buildings for Hector. By 20 I owned them. The lawyers who used to cross the street when they saw me coming now call my office begging for lease agreements. He sat down across from her, his attention focused entirely on her face. You know what I learned in those years? That violence gets you what you want. That patience gets you everything. Violence is just what happens to people who mistake patience for weakness. Annie picked up her fork, the crab still steaming slightly. And Russell mistook your patience for weakness. Russell mistook a lot of things. Including the fact that I've been patient about you for 4 months, waiting for the right moment to make my interest clear. He did me a favor by showing up when he did. By crashing your fundraiser. By giving me a reason to stop being subtle. Ralph broke apart his own crab, the motion casual despite the weight of what he was saying. I built an empire from nothing, Annie. I know the difference between something I want and something I need. You're not a want. Then what am I? Ralph looked up, and the intensity in his expression made her breath catch. You're the first thing in 15 years I've been willing to risk everything to keep. The first contract cancellation came Thursday morning via email. Meridian Development regretted to inform her that due to unforeseen budget constraints, they would be postponing their annual gala indefinitely. The deposit would be returned within 30 business days. Annie stared at the email in her Brickell office, her coffee going cold in her hand. Meridian had signed the contract 6 weeks ago. She'd already booked the venue, contracted with vendors, designed the entire aesthetic around their corporate rebrand. Budget constraints was corporate speak for we changed our minds, and companies didn't change their minds about $60,000 events without a reason. The second cancellation came that afternoon. Hartwell Financial called personally, which was worse than an email because Annie had to listen to Patricia Hartwell stumble through an explanation about going in a different creative direction for their charity auction. "We really appreciate the work you've done so far. We'll make sure you're compensated for your time. It's just, well, we think a different approach might be more aligned with our current vision. Patricia, we spent 2 months developing this approach together. What changed?" A pause that lasted too long. "Nothing changed. We just need to explore other options." The third cancellation came Friday via her lawyer. Castellano Properties was invoking the termination clause in their contract, citing concerns about vendor reliability. No further explanation. No conversation. Just a legal letter that said they no longer required her services. Annie sat in her office after Melissa left for the day, looking at her calendar with holes where 3 major events used to be. $60,000 from Meridian. $45,000 from Hartwell. $80,000 from Castellano. Nearly $200,000 gone in 48 hours. Her phone buzzed. Ralph's name appeared on the screen. "How bad is it?" She almost asked how he knew, then realized he probably knew before she did. "How bad is what?" "The contracts. Carlos tells me you've been at your desk for 6 hours without moving. 3 clients in 2 days. All with excuses that don't make sense." She closed her eyes, hating that she was telling him this, hating more that he was the only person who would understand exactly what was happening. "Russell called in favors, didn't he? My investigator confirmed it an hour ago. Russell's firm has relationships with all 3 companies. He made calls. Expressed concerns about your stability, your professional judgment, your ability to handle high-profile events given your personal complications." Annie's hand tightened around her phone. "He's destroying my business. He's trying to. There's a difference." Ralph's voice stayed level, but something underneath suggested he was already calculating solutions. "I can fix this. 1 conversation with each company and your contracts are reinstated by Monday." "No. Annie. No." She stood up, pacing to her office window. "I didn't build this company so someone else could save it when things got hard. I'll handle this myself." "By doing what exactly?" "By booking 10 new clients who don't have any connection to Russell or his firm. By proving that my work speaks louder than whatever poison he's spreading." She pulled up her contact list, already mentally sorting through prospects. "I have meetings scheduled through next Thursday." Ralph was quiet for a moment. "You're serious?" "I'm always serious about my business." That's what Russell never understood. The Wynwood warehouse had good bones. Annie walked the perimeter Tuesday afternoon, taking measurements and photos for a tech company's product launch. The exposed brick and industrial lighting would work perfectly with the aesthetic the client wanted. She was calculating how many installations could fit in the main space when she felt it, that pressure between her shoulder blades that meant someone was watching. Russell stood across the street next to a gallery that sold street art to tourists for prices that would make the original artists laugh. He wasn't hiding. Wasn't pretending to be there for any reason except her. Annie's hand went to her phone, but before she could dial, Carlos appeared from a black SUV she hadn't noticed parked 2 spaces down. Another security guard she recognized from Ralph's team materialized near the warehouse entrance. Carlos crossed the street with the calm of someone who'd done this before. The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds. Russell gestured, his voice rising enough that Annie caught fragments. "Just talking. Public street. Can't stop me from." Carlos said something too quiet to hear, and Russell's face went red. He looked past Carlos, looked directly at Annie, and his expression wasn't the apologetic ex from her office or the rehearsed romantic from the fundraiser. It was something uglier, something that had maybe always been there underneath the I love yous and the promises to change. You think you're better than me now? Russell's voice carried across the street. You think being with some criminal makes you special? You're making a mistake, Annie. A huge mistake, and when you figure that out, don't come crying back to me. Carlos moved between them, blocking Russell's line of sight. The second guard was on his phone, probably calling Ralph, probably explaining that the situation was contained but not resolved. Annie stood in the warehouse doorway, her measurements forgotten, watching Russell get back in his rental car with the kind of angry precision that made doors slam harder than necessary. He wasn't trying to win her back. That fantasy had shattered somewhere between the fundraiser and now. He was trying to prove she'd made a mistake by leaving, trying to force her to admit that life without him was harder, messier, more complicated than the safe mediocrity he'd offered. The warehouse suddenly felt too exposed, all those windows and open spaces that would be perfect for a party but terrible for safety. Annie's phone buzzed. Ralph's text was 3 words, "Are you okay?" She typed back, "He was just watching." The response came immediately, "Watching is enough. Come to Coconut Grove. I have 4 more site visits today. Carlos will drive you to all of them. Come to Coconut Grove after." It wasn't really a question. Annie looked at Carlos, who was still standing on the street, positioned between where Russell's car had been and where she stood. She thought about the 3 cancelled contracts, the 43 phone calls, the way Russell had looked at her like she was something he owned that had been stolen. She texted back, "I'll be there by 7. Ralph picked Annie up from Coconut Grove at 9 on Wednesday night, after her last client meeting ran 2 hours over. He was driving himself, no Carlos, no security detail visible, which should have been her first sign that tonight was different. "We're not going to Brickell," he said, pulling onto the highway heading west. "Where are we going?" "Hialeah. To my actual office. You have offices in Brickell and downtown. I have real estate headquarters in those places. Where we're going is where the real business happens." He glanced at her, his expression unreadable in the dashboard lights. "You've been asking questions about what I actually do. Tonight you get answers, but after tonight, you don't get to unsee what I show you." The warehouse sat in an industrial area where legitimate businesses closed at 5 and no one asked questions about the ones that stayed open later. Ralph parked in a lot surrounded by security cameras, and 2 men Annie didn't recognize opened a reinforced door from the inside. The space looked like any warehouse office, desks and computers and filing cabinets, until Annie noticed the details. The cash counting machines in the corner. The security monitors showing angles of buildings she recognized from her event locations. The wall map with color-coded pins marking territories across South Florida. "This is where we process payments from businesses who need protection," Ralph said, walking her past a conference room where 3 men were dividing stacks of cash into labeled envelopes. "This is where we track shipments that customs doesn't need to know about. This is where we plan acquisitions of properties whose owners suddenly decide selling is in their best interest." Annie's throat went dry. She'd known, abstractly, that Ralph's empire wasn't built on legitimate real estate deals alone. But knowing and seeing were catastrophically different things. Ralph led her to his private office in the back, smaller than his Brickell penthouse, more utilitarian. A desk, a safe, a wall of monitors. He pulled up footage that made Annie's blood go cold. Not Russell's rental car. Her own apartment building in Brickell. Her office in the design district. The coffee shop where she met clients. All dated from 5 months ago, a month before she even started working Ralph's events. "You've been watching me since before we met," Annie said, her voice barely steady. "I've been watching you since I saw you argue with a venue coordinator about lighting angles at the Perez Museum Gala last spring. You told her that good enough wasn't good enough, that excellence wasn't negotiable." Ralph turned the monitor toward her, showing footage of her walking into her office building, dated 4 weeks before his first event contract. "I knew then I wanted you. I just needed the right opportunity to make my interest clear. So you hired me. So I created a situation where you'd be close enough for me to understand how to keep you. He pulled up more footage, and Annie's stomach dropped. Russell's rental car appeared on screen, but the timestamp was from 3 weeks ago, days before the fundraiser. Russell talking to someone outside a Coral Gables restaurant. Russell meeting with a man Annie recognized as one of Ralph's competitors. You knew Russell was coming to Miami, Annie whispered. I knew Russell had been planning this grand gesture for months. He'd been asking mutual contacts about you, researching your business, waiting for the perfect moment to show up and prove he'd changed. Ralph's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes suggested he was watching for her reaction carefully. So I made sure that moment happened at my fundraiser, where I could control every variable. You manipulated me. I created an opportunity. There's a difference. Ralph stood, moving closer but not touching her. Russell was always going to come back. Men like him always do. I just made sure when he came back, you'd already have someone who could protect you. Someone who could show you what it looks like when a man sees your strength as an asset instead of a threat. Annie's hands were shaking. Everything, the public claim, the protection, the contracts Russell cancelled, all of it orchestrated. Not all of it, Ralph said. The contracts were Russell's own desperation. I didn't need to manufacture that. But yes, I positioned pieces on the board and waited for both of you to move exactly as I knew you would. Why are you telling me this? Because you need to understand what being with me actually means. Ralph's hand finally touched her face, his thumb tracing her cheekbone. I don't play fair. I don't wait for opportunities, I create them. I saw what I wanted and I built the perfect situation to make you choose me. His eyes held hers, unblinking. Now you decide. Walk away knowing I manipulated you into this, or stay knowing that you chose a man calculating enough to engineer your love. Annie should have been horrified. Should have been running for the door, calling lawyers, ending whatever this was before it consumed her completely. Instead, she felt something else entirely. Understanding. Because she'd been playing her own game too, hadn't she? Accepting Ralph's protection while building connections through his network. Using his resources to expand her business into territories she could never have accessed alone. She'd thought she was maintaining her independence. Now she realized she'd been playing checkers while Ralph played chess. Show me everything, Annie said finally. Not just the money laundering and the protection rackets. Show me how you actually built this. Show me the real power structure. Ralph's expression shifted into something that looked almost like pride. He pulled up files on his computer, spreadsheets that mapped out an empire more complex than she'd imagined. City officials on his payroll. Legitimate businesses that served as fronts. A network that touched every major development project in South Florida. Your event company is perfect, Ralph said, pulling up a document with her business name on it. High-profile clients, access to wealthy targets, legitimate reasons to be in buildings I need to access. You've already helped me more than you realize. That hotel CEO you introduced me to last month? He's been blocking my Brickell expansion for 2 years. After your introduction, he called me personally to discuss partnership opportunities. Because I vouched for you. Because you're brilliant at reading people and knowing exactly what they need to hear. Ralph turned to face her fully. I can teach you everything. How to identify targets, how to build leverage, how to turn your talent for creating experiences into something that generates real power. Or you can walk away, and I'll make sure Russell never bothers you again regardless. And if I stay? If I choose this? Then you stop pretending you're only interested in designing pretty parties. You build an empire beside me, and we stop lying to each other about what we actually are. What are we? Two people too ambitious for ordinary love. Two people who see power and want more of it. His hands slid to the back of her neck. Two people who recognize that partnership means making each other more dangerous, not safer. Annie kissed him, not because she forgave the manipulation but because she understood it. Because she'd spent 7 years with a man who needed her small and 2 weeks with a man who'd orchestrated an entire scenario to claim her publicly. The difference was that Ralph had never pretended to be anything other than what he was. "Teach me," she said against his mouth. "Teach me everything." Annie just chose to learn from the man who orchestrated her entire relationship. But Ralph's manipulation goes deeper than she knows. If you're not subscribed yet, do it now because the final reveal in Chapter 9 is going to change everything you thought about this story. Ralph's Fisher Island estate sat on 2 acres of waterfront that probably cost more than Annie would earn in a lifetime even with her most successful year. He drove them across on the last ferry Thursday night, after 4 hours in the Hialeah warehouse where he'd shown her not just the operations but the strategy behind them, the 10-year plan that would make his empire untouchable. Annie had expected to feel manipulated. Instead, she felt like she'd finally found someone who played at her level. The house was smaller than the Coconut Grove compound, more private, the kind of place where someone went when they wanted to be seen only by people who mattered. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Biscayne Bay, Miami's skyline glittering in the distance like a promise of everything they could control. Ralph poured wine without asking if she wanted any, handed her a glass, and waited. He'd been waiting since they left Hialeah, giving her space to process not just what she'd seen but what she'd agreed to become. "I have questions," Annie said finally. "Ask them." "The surveillance footage from 5 months ago. How long were you watching before you made contact?" 6 weeks. Long enough to understand your patterns, your ambitions, the fact that you were building something impressive but hitting a ceiling because you didn't have the right connections. Ralph sat across from her, his posture relaxed but his attention absolute. "Long enough to know that you were exactly what I needed." Which was what? A legitimate front? A partner who wouldn't flinch when she understood what partnership actually required. He leaned forward slightly. "I've had dozens of business relationships, Annie. People who work for me, people who owe me, people who fear me enough to cooperate. But partnership requires someone who sees the game clearly and wants to play it anyway. You gambled that I would. I don't gamble. I calculate. And everything about you told me you were tired of playing small. The way you negotiated contracts, the way you handled vendors who tried to shortchange you, the way you walked into rooms like you owned them even when you were the least powerful person there." Ralph's eyes stayed on hers. "You were already ruthless. You just needed someone to give you permission to admit it." Annie should have denied it. Should have insisted she was just ambitious, just driven, just trying to build a successful business. But sitting in Ralph's Fisher Island estate with Miami glowing across the water, she couldn't pretend anymore. "Russell used to say I was cold," she said quietly. "That I cared more about my business than about us. That I calculated everything instead of just feeling." Russell was intimidated by competence. Ralph stood, closing the distance between them. "I'm attracted to it." He kissed her like he'd already won, which maybe he had the moment she walked into that warehouse and didn't run. Annie kissed him back like someone who'd spent 7 years apologizing for being too much and was done pretending she wanted to be less. They moved to the bedroom overlooking the bay, and everything about it felt different than Annie expected. Ralph wasn't gentle or careful. He was demanding, possessive, absolutely certain of what he wanted and uninterested in pretending otherwise. His hands mapped her body like territory he'd already claimed, and Annie realized this was what she'd been missing with Russell. The absence of apology. The presence of matching intensity. "You're not going to be satisfied with just designing events anymore," Ralph said afterward, his hands still on her hip like even in the aftermath he needed to maintain contact. "You're going to want more. More access, more influence, more power. And every time you get it, you're going to need more." "You sound very certain." "Because I recognize addiction when I see it. Power is addictive, Annie. And you've just had your first real taste." His thumb traced circles on her skin. "The question isn't whether you'll want more. The question is how far you're willing to go to get it." Annie thought about the surveillance footage, the manipulation, the calculated orchestration of everything that had happened between them. She thought about Russell's cancelled contracts and how satisfying it had been to watch his professional reputation crumble. She thought about the hotel's CEO who'd called Ralph after she vouched for him, and how good it felt to be the person who opened that door. "How far are you willing to take me?" Ralph's smile was sharp enough to cut. "As far as you can stomach. Maybe further." The Vizcaya Museum wedding was Annie's statement to Miami that Russell Lampkins hadn't destroyed her career, he'd just made her more valuable to the people who actually mattered. She'd spent 2 weeks perfecting every detail, from the garden ceremony overlooking Biscayne Bay to the reception in the courtyard where string lights turned the Italian Renaissance architecture into something that would generate social media coverage for months. What the guests didn't know was that half of them were on Ralph's payroll in one way or another, and Annie had positioned herself as the social architect who could make those connections invisible. Russell appeared during cocktail hour, walking past security with the confident stride of someone who believed he still had power in the situation. Annie saw him before he saw her, and her first instinct wasn't fear. It was a calculation. Ralph had positioned 3 security cameras to capture every angle. Carlos was 20 feet away with 2 backup guards. And Miami's elite were watching, which meant whatever happened next would be witnessed and remembered. Annie pulled out her phone and texted Ralph, "He's here." Perfect timing. The response came immediately. Give him 2 minutes to make it worse. Russell found her near the Baroque fountain, his expression somewhere between desperate and entitled, exactly as Ralph had predicted. "You think you've won something, but you're making a mistake. Swanson is using you, Annie. He's a criminal. Everyone knows it. When this catches up to him, you'll go down too." Is that a threat or a prediction? It's a fact. You think I don't know what he is? I've been researching him for weeks. Do you know how many people he's destroyed? How many businesses he's ruined? You're next, Annie. You're just too blind to see it. Russell's voice was rising, drawing attention exactly as Ralph said it would. Judge Morales was watching. 3 city council members were watching. The bride's family, who had connections to the Miami Herald, were recording on their phones. Ralph arrived before Russell could continue, Carlos and 2 other security guards behind him. But Ralph walked straight to Annie, ignoring Russell completely until he was standing beside her, his hand finding the small of her back with the possessive certainty of someone who'd choreographed this entire scene. "You violated a restraining order," Ralph said to Russell, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "That's a crime. But I'm going to give Annie a choice about how we handle this." He turned to her, and Annie saw it then. The calculation in his eyes. The setup. This wasn't about giving her agency. This was about making her complicit. Making her choose his methods publicly, in front of witnesses who would remember that Annie Pinero had chosen Ralph Swanson's justice over the legal system. "I can make this problem disappear permanently," Ralph said, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "One phone call. Or we can destroy him legally, use every resource I have to expose everything he's done. Your decision, Annie." The old Annie would have chosen legal destruction because it felt cleaner, more justifiable. The woman standing in Vizcaya's garden understood that Ralph was offering her something else entirely. The chance to be publicly ruthless. The chance to show Miami's elite exactly who she was becoming. "Legal destruction," she said clearly. "I want everyone to know exactly who Russell Lampkins is. Every woman he harassed. Every complaint his father buried. Every lie he told about being changed. I want his reputation destroyed so completely that his name becomes a warning." Ralph's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes suggested satisfaction. Carlos moved forward, physically escorting Russell out while the man shouted threats that only made him look more unhinged to the 200 witnesses. The wedding continued. Annie coordinated every remaining detail flawlessly. And she watched as guests who'd been questioning Ralph's claim about her now looked at her with a new understanding. She wasn't just the event planner. She was the woman who'd stood beside Ralph Swanson and chosen his version of justice without hesitation. By Monday, 7 women had come forward with harassment complaints against Russell that Ralph's investigators had carefully documented and presented to the right journalists. By Wednesday, Russell's consulting firm issued a statement about not tolerating workplace misconduct and terminated his partnership. By Friday, Russell's professional reputation was rubble, and Annie received 12 new event consultation requests from clients who wanted the social architect who destroyed a man in front of Miami's elite without raising her voice. She was in her design district office reviewing contracts when Ralph appeared with an expression she'd learned meant he had something important to say. "Come with me," he said. "I have proposals due tomorrow. They can wait. This can't." He drove them to Key Biscayne, to a stretch of beach where the city felt distant enough to be irrelevant. The sun was setting, turning the sky colors that belonged in her event designs, and Ralph turned to face her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I need to tell you something," he said. "And after I tell you, you can walk away or you can stay, but you need to know the truth." Annie's pulse quickened. "What truth?" "The surveillance didn't start 5 months ago. It started 8 months ago, right after I saw you at that museum gala. I didn't just track Russell's plans to come to Miami. I encouraged them. I had someone reach out to him anonymously, suggest that you were struggling in Miami, that you probably regretted leaving him. I planted the idea that a grand gesture might work." Annie's chest tightened. "You manipulated him into coming here. I created the optimal conditions for you to choose me." Ralph's expression was steady, unflinching. "Russell was always going to try again eventually. I just controlled the timing and the location. I made sure when he showed up, you'd already have someone positioned to protect you, someone who could demonstrate what real power looks like compared to Russell's entitled mediocrity." "The cancelled contracts," Annie said slowly. "Those were really Russell? Those were Russell's own desperation, triggered by seeing you with me. I didn't need to manufacture that part. But yes, I orchestrated the initial confrontation. I positioned every piece on the board and waited for both of you to move exactly as I calculated you would." He stepped closer. "I saw what I wanted 8 months ago, and I spent 8 months learning everything about you so I could engineer a situation where you'd choose me. Not just choose me, but choose the version of yourself that stops apologizing for being ambitious and ruthless and hungry for power." Annie should have been horrified. Should have been running. Should have been calling the police or her lawyer or anyone who could help her understand that this was manipulation on a scale that went beyond ruthless into something darker. Instead, she felt something else. Clarity. Because she'd been playing her own game, hadn't she? Using Ralph's network to build connections she could never access alone. Positioning herself as indispensable to his operation while telling herself she was maintaining independence. Enjoying the power that came from being the woman beside Ralph Swanson while pretending she was just the event planner. She'd been lying to herself. Ralph had just forced her to see it. "You orchestrated everything," Annie said. "The fundraiser. The public claim. Russell showed up so you could position yourself as my protector. You manipulated me into falling for you. I created optimal conditions," Ralph corrected. "But your feelings, your choices, those were real. You didn't fall for a performance, Annie. You fell for exactly who I am. Someone calculating enough to spend 8 months positioning pieces so you'd choose me. Someone ruthless enough to manipulate your ex into giving me the perfect opportunity. Someone who saw your potential and decided I wanted you beside me building something that matters. And if I walk away now? Then you walk away knowing the truth, and I make sure Russell never bothers you again regardless. You keep your business, your reputation, everything you've built." Ralph's hand touched her face, gentle despite everything he'd just confessed. "But we both know you're not going to walk away." "Why?" "Because you manipulated me so perfectly. Because you're not horrified by the manipulation. You're impressed by it." His thumb traced her cheekbone. "You're standing here calculating how to use this information, how to position yourself now that you understand the full scope of what I'm capable of. You're not a victim in this story, Annie. You're a player who just learned the real rules." Annie's heart was pounding, but not from fear. From recognition. Because Ralph was right. She wasn't horrified. She was fascinated. turned on by the sheer scope of his calculation. Impressed that he'd seen her clearly enough 8 months ago to know exactly how to make her choose him. She thought about Russell, who'd spent 5 years trying to make her smaller. She thought about Ralph, who'd spent 8 months learning how to make her more. The difference wasn't manipulation versus honesty. The difference was that Ralph had never pretended she was anything other than ambitious, ruthless, and hungry for exactly the kind of power he could teach her to wield. "Teach me," Annie said finally. "Not just the operations and the money laundering and the fronts. Teach me how you think. How you calculate 8 months ahead. How you position pieces so precisely that people choose exactly what you want them to choose while believing it was their idea." Ralph's expression shifted into something that looked almost like love, if love could be possessive and calculating and absolutely certain of its victory. "That's my girl," he said. "Now ask me the real question. Which is whether I'll ever manipulate you again." Annie looked at him, this man who'd orchestrated everything, who'd watched her for 8 months and learned her well enough to engineer her love. "Will you?" So here's the question, is Annie empowered or trapped? Is this the darkest romance you've ever heard or the most honest? I want to know what you think. Comment below, and if you stayed till this point in the story, hit subscribe. You're clearly our kind of viewer. Now, Ralph's about to give his answer. "Every single day," Ralph said. "And you'll do the same to me." That's what partnership means when both people are ruthless enough to admit what they actually want. We'll manipulate and calculate and position pieces, and we'll both know we're doing it, and that honesty is more intimate than anything Russell ever gave you. Annie kissed him, not because she'd forgiven the manipulation but because she understood that forgiveness wasn't the point. The point was recognition. Ralph had seen exactly who she was and wanted her anyway. Had wanted her enough to spend 8 months engineering the perfect circumstances for her to choose him. "Yes," she said against his mouth. "I'll build something permanent with you. Not despite the manipulation. Because of it. Because only someone that calculates could match what I actually am." Ralph smiled, and Annie realized this was the first time she'd seen him smile with complete unguarded satisfaction. Like he'd been waiting 8 months for her to finally catch up to where he'd always known she'd arrive. They stood on Key Biscayne as the sun set over Miami, two people too ambitious for ordinary love, too ruthless for traditional partnership, too calculating to pretend they wanted anything other than power and the perfect person to help them seize more of it. "She already has me," Ralph had said at the fundraiser. Standing on the beach with his hand in hers and the truth between them, Annie finally understood what that meant. Not possession. Not protection. Recognition. The kind where two people see each other clearly and choose each other anyway, not despite the darkness but because of it. Behind them, Miami glowed in the gathering dark, a city full of people who would talk about the event designer who chose the Mafia boss, who would debate whether she was a victim or a villain, who would never understand that she was neither. She was a partner. And partnership, Annie had finally learned, wasn't about being saved or protected or cherished despite your flaws. It was about finding someone ruthless enough to celebrate them.